The autumn wind carried dust and whispers of old grudges through Pine Ridge, Montana, as Abigail Foster stepped down from the westbound train, her weathered carpetbag in one hand and 7-year-old Emma's trembling fingers in the other. 4-year-old Luke clung to her faded blue dress, his eyes wide with the uncertainty that had followed them from Chicago's crowded tenements. The platform stretched empty before them except for tumbleweeds and the distant sound of hammering from the town's modest buildings. Abby's heart hammered too, matching the rhythm of her children's nervous breathing as she searched for Nathan Crawford's familiar face among the shadows. But only the station master emerged from his small office, his expression troubled as he approached their little family with news that would change everything. Mrs. Foster, I presume. The elderly man removed his cap, revealing silver hair and worried eyes that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken troubles. I'm Harold Jessup, station master, and I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Mr. Crawford. Abby felt Emma's grip tighten as Luke buried his face deeper into her skirts, somehow sensing the gravity of the moment. The correspondence that had brought them here, Nathan's careful letters promising a home, stability, and love for all three of them, suddenly felt as fragile as autumn leaves in her memory. Harold's weathered hands twisted his cap nervously as he continued. He's gone missing, ma'am. Been 3 days now since anyone's seen hide nor hair of him. The words hit Abby like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain steady for her children's sake, her mother's instinct stronger than her own fear and disappointment. Missing, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper as she processed this devastating turn of events. Emma looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing, while Luke whimpered softly against her legs. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the platform, making everything feel dreamlike and uncertain, as if they'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. Harold shuffled his feet uncomfortably, clearly dreading what he had to say next about the situation that had driven Nathan away. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. It's the feud, ma'am, Harold said quietly, glancing around as if the very words might summon trouble from the hills. The Crawfords and Morrisons have been at each other's throats for nigh on 20 years, and Nathan, well, he got caught in the middle when his uncle found out about his plans to marry you. The revelation struck Abby like lightning. This wasn't just about a nervous groom, but about a blood feud that threatened to tear apart any hope of the peaceful life she'd traveled so far to find. Emma tugged at her sleeve, asking in a small voice, Mama, what's a feud? While Luke began to cry softly, sensing the tension that suddenly filled the air. The hammering from town had stopped, and in the silence, Abby could hear her own heart breaking for the third time in her 28 years, first her husband's death, then their eviction from Chicago, and now this crushing blow to her last hope. Harold's explanation unfolded like a dark tapestry of old wounds and stubborn pride that had poisoned Pine Ridge for decades. Started over water rights, then land disputes, then it became about the hurt itself, he said, his voice heavy with the weariness of a man who'd watched his community tear itself apart. The Crawfords controlled the east side of the valley, the Morrisons the west, and Nathan had been foolish enough to believe love could bridge that divide. Abby listened with growing horror as Harold described shootings, burned crops, and children raised to hate before they could even understand why. The train whistle echoed mournfully in the distance, as if mourning for all the lives this senseless conflict had claimed, while her own children clung to her with increasing desperation. As darkness began to settle over the desolate platform, Abby realized she faced an impossible choice: return to Chicago's poverty and uncertainty, or somehow forge a path forward in this hostile, divided town. The return tickets would cost money she didn't have, and winter was coming fast to Montana's unforgiving landscape. Emma looked up at her with trust so complete it nearly broke her heart, while Luke had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted by the journey and emotional turmoil. Harold cleared his throat apologetically, mentioning a boarding house run by Mrs. Henley, a widow who sometimes took in stranded travelers. But even as she nodded gratefully, Abby's mind was already working, her natural peacemaker's instinct beginning to stir despite the overwhelming circumstances they faced. Mrs. Henley's boarding house stood like a beacon of warmth against the cold Montana night, its yellow windows casting golden rectangles of hope onto the dusty street. The proprietor herself, kindly woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and gentle hands, welcomed them without question. instinctively understanding the desperate circumstances that had brought a single mother and her children to Pine Ridge. "You poor dears," she murmured, ushering them into a clean, modest room that smelled of lavender and fresh bread. Emma and Luke fell asleep almost immediately in the comfortable bed, their small bodies finally relaxing after days of travel and uncertainty. But Abby sat by the window far into the night, staring out at the divided town and wondering if God had brought them here for a purpose greater than her own happiness. The next morning brought Reverend Samuel Cross to Mrs. Henley's door, his weathered face kind but marked by the strain of ministering to a fractured community. "I heard about your situation, Mrs. Foster," he said gently, accepting her offer of coffee with hands that shook slightly from years of trying to heal unhealable wounds. He explained that Nathan had fled to avoid choosing between his bride and his family's honor, leaving behind a town more divided than ever. When the Reverend offered to arrange their passage back east, Abby felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. But looking at Emma, who was teaching Luke to braid grass stems on the porch, she made the choice that would define not only their future, but the future of Pine Ridge itself. "Reverend, I believe the Lord brought us here for a reason, and I intend to see what that reason might be." Reverend Cross's eyes widened with a mixture of admiration and concern as Abby explained her growing conviction that she could somehow help heal the wounds that had festered in Pine Ridge for too long. "Mrs. Foster," he said carefully, "you don't understand the depth of this hatred. It's claimed lives, destroyed families, poisoned children against each other." But Abby had grown up mediating between her own siblings, had learned to find common ground where others saw only division, and something in her spirit recognized a calling in this broken place. Emma looked up from her grass braiding to ask, "Mama, are we staying?" And when Abby nodded, the child's face lit up with the resilience that had carried them through every hardship. The Reverend sighed deeply, then offered whatever help he could provide, warning that the path ahead would test every ounce of her faith and determination. The first week in Pine Ridge revealed the true scope of the town's division. The main street literally split between Crawford and Morrison territories, with neutral ground existing only in the church, the general store, and Mrs. Henley's boarding house. Children walked to school in separate groups. Merchants chose sides in every transaction, and even the cemetery was divided by an invisible line of bitter memory. Abby observed it all with a growing sense of heartbreak and purpose, watching families torn apart by inherited hatred that most couldn't even properly explain anymore. Emma made friends easily with children from both sides, her innocent questions often revealing the absurdity of prejudices their parents had never thought to examine. Luke, too young to understand the complexities, simply played with whoever would play with him, his laughter a rare sound of joy in the tense atmosphere. As autumn deepened into winter's approach, Abby began her quiet work of bridge building, starting with small acts of kindness that crossed the invisible battle lines dividing Pine Ridge. She helped Mrs. Crawford with her sick baby, despite whispered warnings about taking sides, then spent the next day assisting old Morrison with his failing eyesight as he struggled to read his mail. Her children became her unwitting ambassadors of peace, playing with Crawford and Morrison children alike, slowly breaking down barriers that adults had built so carefully. The townspeople watched her with curiosity and suspicion, unable to categorize this gentlewoman who refused to choose sides in their ancient war. Even Mrs. Henley warned her to be careful, explaining that neutrality itself could be seen as a kind of betrayal in a town where everyone was expected to hate. The morning Jeremiah Morrison appeared on Mrs. Henley's porch marked Abby's true entrance into the dangerous world of Pine Ridge's blood feud. The Morrison patriarch stood tall and forbidding, his steel-gray eyes burning with decades of accumulated rage as he demanded to know why she was consorting with Crawford's spawn. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and his presence seemed to drain warmth from the very air around them. But Abby met his gaze steadily, her children pressed close behind her as she explained simply that she served only God and sought only peace for all his children. Morrison's laugh was bitter as winter wind, and his parting words chilled her more than the Montana air. "Mrs. Foster, you'll learn soon enough that some wounds are too deep to heal, and some people too proud to forgive." As he rode away, Abby realized she had just declared war on war itself. Reverend Cross became Abby's closest ally in her mission of reconciliation, sharing the painful history that had turned neighbor against neighbor in Pine Ridge. He told her of the original water dispute that had escalated when young Thomas Crawford was found shot dead near Morrison Land. followed by mysterious barn fires that consumed Morrison crops for 3 straight years. Each act of revenge had bred another, until the original cause was lost in a maze of hurt and retribution that seemed to feed on itself. Emma listened wide-eyed to these stories while Luke played quietly with his wooden toys, both children beginning to understand why the town felt so heavy with unspoken sadness. The Reverend's own exhaustion showed in every line of his face as he admitted his failure to bring peace, his sermons falling on hearts hardened by generations of taught hatred. Mrs. Henley proved another unexpected source of wisdom, having lived through every phase of the feud with the particular insight of someone who had chosen neutrality over profit. "It's the women who suffer most," she confided to Abby over evening tea, her voice soft with remembered pain. "They watch their sons grow up to hate, their husbands brood over ancient slights, their daughters learn to fear half the world before they can even read." She spoke of Mary Crawford, Nathan's mother, who had lost 2 sons to the feud and lived in constant terror that Nathan would be next, which explained why she had fought so desperately against his marriage plans. Similarly, she described Sarah Morrison, who had buried her husband and brother to Crawford bullets and now raised her grandsons to carry on the vendetta. These women, Abby realized, held the key to peace, if only someone could help them see past their grief to their shared humanity. The children of Pine Ridge became Abby's most hopeful discovery, their natural inclination toward play and friendship constantly battling against the hatred their parents tried to instill. She organized informal gatherings at the church, ostensibly for Bible stories but actually designed to let Crawford and Morrison children see each other as individuals rather than enemies. Emma proved remarkably gifted at these sessions, her Chicago street-smart wisdom helping her navigate the complex social dynamics, while her genuine kindness drew even the most suspicious children into the circle. Luke's innocent questions often cut straight to the heart of the absurdity. "Why can't Jamie play with us just 'cause his last name is different?" The children's laughter during these gatherings was like medicine for Abby's soul, proof that hatred was learned, not born. Winter's early arrival brought unexpected opportunities for bridge building, as harsh weather made survival more important than feuding. When the Morrisons' roof collapsed under heavy snow, trapping elderly Martha Morrison inside, it was Crawford men who arrived first to dig her out, their humanity overriding their hatred in the face of immediate need. Abby was there to witness Mary Crawford and Sarah Morrison working side by side to tend Martha's injuries, their animosity temporarily forgotten in the face of a greater emergency. For one precious hour, the women had been simply neighbors helping a neighbor, and Abby caught glimpses of who they might have been without the poison of the feud. The moment passed, of course, and by the next day the old hostilities had reasserted themselves. But Abby had seen something that gave her hope, the buried humanity that still existed. Beneath layers of learned hatred, the mystery of Nathan's whereabouts began to unravel when Abby discovered he was hiding in an old hunting cabin deep in the hills, paralyzed by his inability to choose between love and family loyalty. Reverend Cross had been secretly bringing him supplies, torn between his pastoral duty to help and his fear of making the situation worse. Nathan's letters, which the Reverend finally shared with Abby's permission, revealed a man tormented by impossible choices. He loved Abby and her children desperately, but couldn't bear to bring more pain to his already devastated mother. His words spoke of sleepless nights spent imagining the violence that might erupt if he defied his family's wishes, and of his cowardly relief at avoiding the decision by simply running away. Reading his anguished confessions, Abby felt her heart break, not with disappointment but with compassion for a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. Standing in Nathan's abandoned cabin, surrounded by the detritus of his tortured indecision, Abby made her deepest commitment not to her missing fiancé, but to the broken community that had shaped him. His letters revealed the true cost of the food, not just the obvious casualties, but the living wounds carried by survivors like Nathan, trapped between love and loyalty, honor and happiness. Emma found a carving Nathan had made of their family herself, Luke and Abby standing together under a tree, and held it out with tears in her young eyes. "He wanted us, Mama," she whispered, and Abby knew then that her mission had become about more than finding a husband or even making peace. It was about healing the deeper wounds that turned good people into prisoners of inherited hatred. She knelt in that cold cabin and made a sacred promise to herself, her children, and the memory of all who had died in this senseless war. She would find a way to break the cycle, no matter the cost to herself. December brought the first major test of Abby's growing influence when young Billy Crawford was caught stealing food from the Morrison store during a particularly harsh blizzard. The boy's father had been injured in a logging accident, leaving the family desperate, but Morrison, tradition demanded harsh punishment for any Crawford transgression. Jeremiah Morrison called for the boy to be publicly whipped, while the Crawfords prepared for armed confrontation rather than see their child humiliated. The town held its breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite another round of violence. As men on both sides began cleaning their guns and sharpening old grievances, Abby found herself standing literally between the two factions in the town square. Her children pressed close to her sides as she prepared to risk everything for the sake of one frightened boy. The confrontation in the town square became Abby's first real victory in the war against hatred, achieved not through force but through the simple power of moral clarity. She stepped forward between the armed men and spoke not of justice or punishment but of the Christian duty to feed the hungry, especially children, especially during the season of Christ's birth. Her words carried weight because everyone had witnessed her own struggles and her willingness to help anyone in need, regardless of their last name. When she offered to pay for Billy's stolen food and personally ensure his family's needs were met through the winter, even Jeremiah Morrison found himself unable to argue with such practical Christian charity. The crowd dispersed without bloodshed, and for the first time in years, a Crawford-Morrison conflict had been resolved through words rather than violence, giving hope to those who still believed in the possibility of peace. The success with Billy Crawford opened doors that had been firmly shut, as both Mary Crawford and Sarah Morrison began to see Abby as someone who might understand their pain rather than simply judge their choices. Mary visited first, her worn hands shaking as she described the terror of losing two sons to the feud and her desperate attempts to protect Nathan from the same fate. She spoke of sleepless nights waiting for gunshots, of teaching her children to duck at the sound of horses, of the way constant fear had stolen joy from what should have been happy family moments. Sarah Morrison's visit came a week later, her voice breaking as she described watching her husband die from Crawford bullets, then raising grandchildren who asked why their grandfather had to be buried instead of coming home for Christmas. Both women wept as they spoke, their grief finally finding expression in the presence of someone who listened without taking sides, who saw their pain rather than their politics. Emma's innocent friendship with both Crawford and Morrison children became a living symbol of the peace Abby was trying to build. But it also made the family targets for those who preferred the clarity of hatred to the complexity of forgiveness. Anonymous threats began appearing under their door, warning Abby to choose a side or leave town, while rocks were thrown at their boarding house windows during the night. Emma asked why people were angry at her for playing with her friends, and Luke began having nightmares about bad men who might hurt his mama. The pressure was intense and constant, designed to drive them away before their influence could spread further among the war-weary residents of Pine Ridge, but each threat only strengthened Abby's resolve, her mother's protective instincts fusing with her peacekeeping mission to create an unshakable determination to see her work through to completion. Christmas approached with unusual tension as both families prepared for what might be the final confrontation over Nathan's future and Abby's continued presence in Pine Ridge. The Crawfords demanded that Nathan return and marry the woman he had promised, while the Morrisons insisted that any such union would be seen as a declaration of war against their interests. Abby found herself at the center of machinations she barely understood, as men whispered about property lines and water rights, old debts and newer grudges that had somehow become entangled with her personal hopes for love and family. The children sensed the growing danger, staying closer to her side and speaking in whispers when they played outside. Even Mrs. Henley admitted she feared for their safety, suggesting it might be time to consider that return passage to Chicago after all. Reverend Croft brought news that Nathan had agreed to return for Christmas Day, finally ready to face whatever consequences his choices might bring. The announcement sent shockwaves through both factions as they prepared for what many believed would be the final battle in their long war. Men cleaned weapons and made wills, women gathered children close and prayed for deliverance, while the few neutral families, like Mrs. Henley's, quietly made plans to leave town if violence erupted. The church became a refuge where people could speak freely without fear of being overheard by the wrong ears, and Abby spent long hours there in prayer, seeking wisdom for the challenges ahead. Emma asked if Nathan coming back meant they would finally have a daddy, and Abby could only hold her close and whispered that they would face whatever came together as a family. Christmas Eve brought the first direct threat to Abby's life when masked riders surrounded Mrs. Henley's boarding house, their torches casting demonic shadows as they demanded that the Crawford bride leave town immediately or face the consequences. The men's voices were muffled, but their intent was clear: they would not allow Nathan's return to proceed, and they held Abby responsible for the crisis that was tearing their community apart. Emma and Luke cowered behind her as she stepped onto the porch to face the mounted figures, her heart hammering but her voice steady as she reminded them that this was holy ground where travelers found sanctuary. The confrontation lasted only minutes, but it marked a crucial escalation in the conflict, making clear that some people would rather see blood spilled than peace achieved. As the riders melted back into the darkness, Abby realized that the next 24 hours would determine not only her family's future but the fate of Pine Ridge itself. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear, with Nathan's return announced by church bells that seemed to carry both celebration and warning across the divided town. He appeared older than his letters had suggested, his face marked by months of internal struggle and the constant fear that had driven him into hiding. When he embraced Abby and the children in the church sanctuary, surrounded by the few neutral townspeople who still believed in the possibility of peace, it felt like a miracle and a declaration of war simultaneously. His mother Mary wept openly, torn between joy at his safety and terror at what his choice might cost their family. The Morrison faction gathered outside, their presence ominous even in the sacred season, while Crawford men fingered their weapons and waited for the spark that would ignite the final confrontation. The Christmas service became a powder keg of barely contained emotions as both families attended church for the first time together in decades, each side watching the other for signs of treachery or weakness. Reverend Cross's sermon on peace and forgiveness carried new weight in the charged atmosphere, his words about turning the other cheek falling on ears that had heard too much violence to easily embrace such radical concepts. Nathan sat between Abby and his mother, physically embodying the choice that was tearing the community apart, while the children sat unusually quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they couldn't fully understand it. When the Reverend called for prayers for peace, the silence that followed was so complete that even the smallest movement seemed to echo like thunder in the tense sanctuary. The confrontation everyone feared began immediately after the service, when Jeremiah Morrison blocked the church steps, demanding that Nathan choose once and for all between his foreign bride and his family's honor. His words carried the weight of 20 years of accumulated grievances, and his challenge could not be ignored without loss of face that would invite further aggression. Nathan stood frozen between the two groups, his internal struggle playing out on his face as he looked from Abby to his mother, to the assembled men who waited for his answer. The children pressed close to Abby, Emma's small hand finding hers as Luke buried his face in her skirts, both sensing that their fragile hope for a new family hung in the balance of this terrible moment. The entire town held its breath as Nathan opened his mouth to speak the words that would determine their fate. Instead of choosing sides, Nathan surprised everyone by falling to his knees in the snow and confessing his cowardice, his voice breaking, as he admitted that running away had solved nothing and only increased the danger to everyone he loved. His vulnerability in that moment broke something open in the crowd as grown men watched him weep for the futility of their long war and the innocent people it had claimed. He spoke of Abby's children, who had asked him in their letters why people had to hate each other, and of his own sleepless nights imagining their tears if violence claimed another generation. When he finally looked up, it was not to choose between the factions but to ask both sides to help him become the man worthy of the woman who had traveled so far to give him a chance at love. His words hung in the crystalline air like a prayer, challenging everyone present to examine their own role in perpetuating the cycle of hatred that had poisoned their community for too long. Mary Crawford stepped forward in that charged moment and did something that shocked both factions into silence. She embraced Sarah Morrison, her supposed mortal enemy, and began to speak through her tears about the letters she had written but never sent over the years. Her words revealed that both women had lost children to the same senseless conflict. Both had spent sleepless nights waiting for violence to claim their remaining loved ones. Both had prayed to the same God for peace while teaching their families to hate. Sarah Morrison's rigid composure cracked as Mary spoke of their shared grief, and she admitted through her own tears that she had often wondered what kind of woman Mary Crawford might have been if they had met as friends rather than enemies. The two matriarchs' emotional breakthrough created a moment of recognition that rippled through both families, as people began to see each other as human beings, rather than abstract enemies for the first time in decades. The alliance between Mary Crawford and Sarah Morrison created an opening that Abby seized with all the diplomatic skill she had developed through months of careful bridge building. She spoke to the crowd about the true cost of the feud, not just the obvious casualties, but the children raised in fear, the dreams deferred by hatred, the love that had been sacrificed on the altar of pride. Her words carried special weight because everyone had witnessed her own sacrifices, her willingness to risk everything for the sake of peace. Her children's innocent questions that had exposed the absurdity of their inherited prejudices when she challenged both families to choose between the past and the future, between revenge and reconciliation, between hatred and hope. Even the most hardened fighters found themselves questioning beliefs they had never thought to examine. Emma stepped forward to take the hands of both Mary and Sarah, her 7-year-old gesture of trust and love speaking louder than any adult argument could have managed. Jeremiah Morrison, the most implacable voice for continued warfare, found himself isolated as his own daughter-in-law Sarah began to speak of her exhaustion with burying loved ones, her fear for her grandchildren's future, her secret dreams of a Pine Ridge where children could play together without fear. His authority, built on others' willingness to follow him into battle, began to crumble as people started questioning whether the price of victory was worth paying. The old man's rage was terrible to behold, but it was also hollow, lacking the support he had always counted on from his community. When even his own grandsons began to ask why they couldn't be friends with the Crawford children they met at school, Jeremiah faced the reality that his war was becoming a lonely crusade against the tide of history. His bitter laugh carried the sound of a man watching his life's work crumble into dust, but also perhaps the first hint of relief at laying down a burden he had carried too long. The Christmas afternoon stretched into evening as the entire town gathered in and around the church for what many sensed might be the final reckoning of their long conflict. Families that had not spoken in years found themselves sharing the same space, their children playing together, while adults awkwardly attempted conversation across old battle lines. Nathan and Abby moved through the crowd together, her presence at his side a living symbol of the choice he had finally made between love and hatred. The potluck supper that emerged spontaneously created moments of connection as people discovered shared recipes, common memories, and mutual friends from the time before the feud had divided their community. Even the men who had cleaned their weapons that morning found themselves laughing at shared jokes and comparing stories of their children's antics. The simple human connections beginning to override years of taught animosity. The peace that seemed so close to realization shattered when a group of die-hard Crawford supporters, led by Nathan's hot-headed cousin Jake, announced they would never accept a truce while Morrison blood still flowed through Pine Ridge's veins. Their challenge to the emerging reconciliation forced everyone to choose once and for all between the old ways of violence and the new possibility of peace. Jake's faction drew weapons and demanded that Nathan prove his family loyalty by denouncing his bride and driving the Morrisons from their land forever, while a smaller group of Morrison fighters prepared to defend themselves against what they saw as inevitable Crawford treachery. The moment balanced on a knife's edge as children screamed and women wept, all the careful work of reconciliation threatening to collapse into the worst violence Pine Ridge had ever seen. Abby found herself standing between the two armed groups, with her children pressed against her sides, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether love or hatred would ultimately triumph in this broken place. The final confrontation began not with gunfire, but with Emma Foster's clear young voice cutting through the chaos as she asked the armed men why they wanted to hurt her friends. Her innocent questions stopped the advancing fighters in their tracks, as these hardened men found themselves looking down at a 7-year-old girl who had somehow become the voice of their community's conscience. Luke stood beside his sister, his 4-year-old hand clasped in hers, both children representing the future that would inherit whatever legacy the adults chose to leave behind. The silence stretched as grown men struggled to explain to innocent children why they felt compelled to continue a war that had already claimed too much, why hatred seemed more important than the happiness of the families they claimed to protect. Jake Crawford's hand trembled on his gun as Emma looked directly at him and asked if killing people would really make his family safer, or if it would just make more children cry like she and Luke had cried when their daddy died in Chicago. Reverend Cross stepped forward in that moment of hesitation and began to recite the names of every person who had died in the Crawford-Morrison feud, his voice carrying across the silent crowd like a funeral dirge for wasted lives. The list was longer than many had realized: sons, fathers, brothers, innocent bystanders caught in crossfire, women who had died from grief, children who had grown up fatherless because of the violence. As each name fell into the winter air, people began to weep for losses they had carried so long they had forgotten how to grieve properly. When he finished with Thomas Crawford, age 19, found shot dead 20 years ago today, the Reverend asked if anyone could honestly say that more death would honor these memories, or if it would simply add more names to his terrible list. The question hung unanswered as men lowered their weapons and women gathered their children closer. Everyone finally forced to confront the true cost of their inherited hatred. Mary Crawford and Sarah Morrison stepped forward together, their alliance now strong enough to challenge the men who would perpetuate the violence that had claimed their loved ones. Mary spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who had buried 2 sons, J. Crawford. "I forbid you to add another name to that list in my family's name." Sarah Morrison's words followed like an echo. "Any Morrison who fires a shot today does so against my wishes and the memory of my dead husband." The 2 matriarchs' united stand broke the back of the resistance, as the fighters found themselves unable to claim they were protecting their families when the family matriarchs themselves demanded peace. Jake's weapon clattered to the ground as he fell to his knees, his rage collapsing into the grief he had never been allowed to express, while other men followed suit, their years of anger finally finding release in tears rather than violence. The transformation rippled through the crowd as people began to comfort former enemies, their shared humanity finally stronger than their inherited hatreds. Nathan found his voice at last, speaking not as a Crawford or as Abby's intended husband, but as a man who had seen what love could accomplish when given a chance to flourish. He told the crowd about the letters Abby had written during their courtship, letters that spoke of hope rather than hatred, of building rather than destroying, of creating a future where children could grow up free from the fears that had shaped their parents' lives. His words painted a vision of Pine Ridge as it could be a community where former enemies worked together to build schools and churches, where children played without reference to their last names, where love was stronger than the sum of old grudges. When he took Abby's hand and asked her to marry him there in the churchyard, surrounded by the people who had learned to choose peace over warfare, her whispered yes seemed to seal not just their personal commitment, but the community's commitment to healing. Emma and Luke cheered, their joy infectious as it spread through the crowd of people who were learning how to celebrate instead of mourn. Jeremiah Morrison made his final stand alone, his weathered face a mask of bitter fury, as he declared that some wounds were too deep to heal, some debts too great to forgive. His challenge to the emerging peace represented the last vestige of the old hatred, the final test of whether Pine Ridge could truly choose love over revenge. But when he looked around for supporters, he found only his own grandsons asking him why he was angry when everyone else was happy. Only his daughter-in-law Sarah pleading with him to let go of the poison that had eaten away at his soul for 20 years. Abby approached him with the same gentle courage she had shown throughout her mission of reconciliation, her voice soft but clear as she offered him the hardest choice of all. "Mr. Morrison, your grandson wants to know if you'll come to our wedding and dance with him the way his grandfather used to before the hatred took that joy away from your family." The old man's fierce composure cracked as he looked into the innocent eyes of the child, who still remembered him as loving grandfather rather than vengeful patriarch. And in that moment the last wall of hatred finally crumbled into dust. The wedding of Nathan Crawford and Abigail Foster took place 3 days later in a church packed with former enemies who had become wedding guests, their presence a living testament to the power of love to overcome the deepest divisions. Emma served as flower girl with Morrison and Crawford children as her attendants, their laughter and joy a sharp contrast to the armed confrontation that had taken place in that same space just days before. Luke walked importantly beside them, carrying the rings on a pillow his mother had embroidered with both family names intertwined in a pattern that symbolized their new unity. The ceremony itself was simple but profound, with vows that spoke not just of personal commitment, but of their dedication to continuing the work of healing that had brought them together. When Reverend Cross pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the congregation seemed to shake the very foundations of the old hatred that had poisoned Pine Ridge for too long. The wedding reception became a celebration of community renewal as former enemies shared food, music, and stories. Their children playing together without the fear that had shadowed their parents' generation. Mary Crawford and Sarah Morrison worked side by side in the kitchen, their easy cooperation a wonder to behold after decades of bitter separation. Jake Crawford found himself deep in conversation with Morrison men about shared concerns: failing crops, harsh winters, the challenges of raising children in an unforgiving land. Discovering that their common struggles far outweighed their inherited differences. Even Jeremiah Morrison, though still gruff and withdrawn, allowed his grandsons to pull him into a reluctant dance, his weathered face softening as he watched them laugh with pure, uncomplicated joy. The evening stretched late into the night, as people lingered, reluctant to end what felt like the first truly happy gathering Pine Ridge had known in a generation. Spring arrived early in Pine Ridge that year, bringing with it changes that seemed miraculous to those who remembered the bitter divisions of the previous autumn. The main street no longer felt like a battleground, with Crawford and Morrison, families shopping side by side, and their children attending the same school without fear or segregation. Nathan and Abby's marriage had become a symbol of what was possible when love conquered hatred, their home serving as neutral ground where both families gathered for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Emma and Luke had blossomed in their new environment, their laughter echoing through the valley as they played with friends whose last names no longer mattered. The cemetery, once divided by invisible lines of ancient grudges, had been reconsecrated as common ground where all of Pine Ridge's dead could rest in peace, their graves tended by former enemies who had learned to share their grief and their hope for the future. The first anniversary of Abby's arrival in Pine Ridge was marked by a community celebration that drew visitors from neighboring towns, all curious to witness the miracle of reconciliation that had transformed the once violent settlement. The story of the single mother who had united a feuding community through love and patience had spread throughout Montana Territory, inspiring other divided communities to believe that peace was possible even in the aftermath of bitter conflict. Reverend Cross delivered a sermon that day about the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when they chose love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair. Emma, now 8 and wise beyond her years, listened proudly as her mother was honored for the courage she had shown in those dark early days when peace seemed impossible. Luke, approaching his 5th birthday, had no memory of the fear and division that had once poisoned their adopted home for him. Pine Ridge had always been a place where people helped each other, where families gathered to celebrate rather than to mourn. As autumn returned to Pine Ridge, painting the hills in brilliant colors that reflected the renewed spirit of the community, Abby stood on her porch watching Emma teach the Morrison and Crawford children a new game she had invented, one that required cooperation rather than competition to succeed. Nathan worked in their garden, his face peaceful in a way that would have been impossible during the dark days of the feud, while Luke helped by collecting more dirt than vegetables in his small basket. The sight filled Abby's heart with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment, surrounded by people who had once been strangers and enemies but who had become the family she had never dared to hope for. Mary Crawford and Sarah Morrison approached arm in arm, carrying fresh bread and news of the harvest festival they were planning together. Their friendship had become one of the strongest bonds in the community, forged in shared grief and strengthened by mutual hope for their grandchildren's future. That evening, as Abby tucked Emma and Luke into their beds in the house Nathan had built for their growing family, Emma asked the question that crystallized everything Abby had learned during their transformative year in Pine Ridge. "Mama, do you think we would have been happy if we had stayed in Chicago?" Abby considered the question seriously, looking out the window at the peaceful valley where former enemies now worked together to build something beautiful from the ashes of their old hatred. "I think God brought us here not just to find happiness, sweetheart, but to help others find it too," she said, smoothing Emma's hair with the same gentle touch that had somehow helped heal an entire community. Luke was already asleep, dreaming the innocent dreams of a child who had never known a world where love was not stronger than hatred, where families were not chosen as often as they were born. As Abby extinguished the lamp and settled beside Nathan in their own bed, she reflected on the truth she had discovered in Pine Ridge. that peace was not the absence of conflict but the presence of love strong enough to overcome any division, and that sometimes the greatest journeys were not the ones that took you to new places, but the ones that showed you how to transform the place where you stood into something worthy of the love you carried in your heart.